Meeting back to order. The next item on the agenda scheduled for 2:30 are two rule packages from the Air Quality Division. We will take them one at a time, with the first being on docket 17-2101 involving Chapter 4, Section 3 and 5, Chapter 14 of the Air Quality Division rules. If the representative from the DEQ would like to come forward and go ahead to proceed with your testimony, please.
Thank you, Ms. Hearing Officer. My name is Nancy Veer, and I'm the administrator for the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Air Quality Division. And with me also from the Air Quality Division is Darian Donnelly, and he's going to be presenting the second rule package. Starting with the first rule package, we also have a representative from Basin Electric, Mr. Pat Day, and I'll start with a couple of opening remarks and then turn it over to Pat, and then Ms. Hearing Officer, if we can then come back to the Air Quality Division, and I can conclude the rulemaking after that. Basin Electric's Laramie River Station has 3 different coal-fire units. This proposed rulemaking changes are the result of a multi-year litigation and negotiated settlement between Basin Electric Power Cooperative, EPA, and the state of Wyoming related to litigation involving the Wyoming's Regional Haze Program. The Regional Haze Program is aimed at reducing particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide emissions in Wyoming. The litigation was with respect to the oxides of nitrogen controls that were going to be required at the Laramie River Station as part of this Regional Haze Program. DEQ issued its Regional Haze State Implementation Plan for NOx controls. Under the state plan, Basin was required to install over-fire air and low NOx burners on all 3 units. In 2014, EPA disapproved the state plan and issued its own federal implementation plan. EPA's federal plan detailed a new, more costly plan for the Laramie River Station. Basin Electric challenged the EPA in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The state of Wyoming, through the Attorney General's office, also appealed EPA's federal plan. And while the litigation was pending, EPA and Basin Electric entered into mediation. During the mediation, there were additional benefits, visibility benefits, and lower emission limits for the Laramie River Station. The settlement created a need to update the Wyoming air quality standards and regulations at Chapter 14. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Pat Day to do a presentation and walk through on the rest of the.
Good afternoon, Madam Hearing Officer, members of the council. I'm here today, Patrick Day. I represent Basin Electric. I'm with Holland & Hart here in town. With me today is in-house counsel Anine Merkins from Basin Electric, and also the Laramie River Station environmental engineer Dave Cummings, in case you have any technical questions that go over my head. This is a very, very important rulemaking for Basin Electric, and I think also for the state of Wyoming. As I'm going to explain briefly, the settlement is going to save Basin Electric about $600 million and result in environmental improvements that are greater than what EPA was going to require under its federal implementation plan. So we consider this a real win-win. This is for the Laramie River Station in Wheatland that Basin Electric operates. As you can see from the stacks, there are 3 separate coal-fired units at the station. What we're seeking from the council is approval to amend what Basin Electric is required to report with respect to its SO2 emissions from the station that will be changed as a result of this settlement. Currently, the rules require that Basin Electric report its actual SO2 emissions, but under the terms of the settlement agreement, Basin Electric is going to be required to report its baseline historical SO2 emissions rather than its actual emissions, so that we don't double count the benefit of SO2 emissions under the Regional Haze Program. It's not a substantive change to the rules. It's simply a reporting change that would apply only to Basin Electric. So we don't believe that it substantively alters the law in any fashion. It simply permits Basin Electric to report a little bit differently than it otherwise would have to do. It's all a result of the BART litigation, which Ms. Veer summarized for you briefly. When we got the state's BART determination back in 2009, the state required Basin Electric to install over-fired air and low NOx burners on all 3 units. Basin Electric did that, and those controls have been operating continuously since they were installed, and they're operating continuously today. We thought we had met the requirements of the Regional Haze Program with the state's plan, but in 2014, EPA disapproved it. And what EPA ordered was that Basin Electric install selective catalytic reduction controls on all 3 units, what we call SCR technology. And the cost of doing so would be about $1 billion. Basin Electric felt strongly that EPA had overstepped its authority and had improperly interfered with the state's right to determine BART under the Clean Air Act. So we filed suit in the 10th Circuit seeking to overturn EPA's plan. The state of Wyoming felt the same way, and the state of Wyoming also joined that litigation in the 10th Circuit against EPA. While that was pending, while the case was pending, we called EPA up and asked them if they would be interested in settling the appeal. And what we wanted to do was propose a different mix of pollution controls that would not be so costly, but which we felt were justified for the purposes of the Regional Haze Program. Specifically, in settlement, we proposed to install 1 selective catalytic reduction control on Unit 1, and then install selective non-catalytic controls on Units 2 and 3. The cost of those controls would be about $400 million, but that's substantially less than the $1 billion that EPA was going to require. EPA came back to us and said that they would be willing to consider that if Basin Electric would also agree to substantially lower emission limits for SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, as part of the BART settlement for NOx emissions. The reason EPA suggested that is that SO2 actually has a little bit greater impact on visibility than NOx. So on a ton-by-ton basis, the more you can reduce SO2, the better visibility benefits you get than lowering NOx. So EPA suggested that we add to the settlement an agreement to lower our emission limits for SO2 from Units 1 and 2. We agreed to do that. The plant has the operational capability to change the way it operates to meet a stricter SO2 emission limit. And although it wasn't required under our permits, we agreed to do that as part of the BART settlement. So as part of the settlement, we're going to install substantial new controls, lower NOx, and we're going to lower our SO2 emissions. SO2 is covered by a separate regional haze program that's separate from the NOx regional haze program. And EPA did not want us to get the ability to credit the SO2 reductions that we were negotiating under the NOx settlement and count them as reductions under the SO2 trading program. They didn't want to double count for the SO2 reductions under both programs. We were happy to do that, but that requires a change to Chapter 14 of the regulations, which require for the SO2 reporting program that Basin Electric report its actual emissions rather than what would be, if we reported our lower actual emissions, we would be double counting. So to not double count, we have to report our historic baseline emissions under the SO2 trading program for regional haze. That requires a change to the rules, which is why we're here today. We approached the state of Wyoming and the Air Quality Division about the terms of the settlement to see if the state would support the settlement. The Air Quality Division evaluated all the technical work that we had done and agreed that the settlement was in everybody's best interest. We then met with Governor Meade. He agreed to support the settlement as well, even though it will take Basin Electric out of the litigation if approved. And at the end of last year, we signed the settlement. So we're now in the process of implementing the settlement, which requires this rule change. And what we're doing is we're going to report SO2 emissions under the historic baseline at 0.159 pounds per million BTU for Unit 1 and 0.162 pounds per million at Unit 2. And we will report using that emission rate against our actual annual heat input for purposes of the Section 309 SO2 program, even though we're agreeing to a much lower 0.12 limit in actual emissions. So we'll be reporting, if you approve our rule change, we'll be reporting at the historic baseline higher rate, even though our actual emissions will be at the lower rate. And what that'll do is prevent us from taking advantage of the reduction under the SO2 program. I hope that made some sense. It's kind of complicated, but that's what we're doing. So we have to change Chapter 14, Section 3, and this is our proposed rule that we're asking for approval from the council today. And it's simply a new subsection D that applies only to Basin Electric and no other producer, allowing us to report our baseline historic rates rather than the new lower NOx settlement rate. That will require the state to amend its state implementation plan to incorporate this rule change, at which point the state will submit its proposed change to its implementation plan to EPA. If EPA approves the revised state plan, which they've said they will do, EPA will then promulgate a new federal implementation plan for Laramie River, incorporating the terms of the settlement, and we will install one SCR and two SNCRs at the 3 units at Laramie River. We're already well on our way to installing those controls. Construction began some time ago because in order for this settlement to work under the regulations, we have to have the SNCR controls in place by the end of 2018. So we need to move through this process as quickly as we can and get EPA's approval in the form of a new federal implementation plan by the middle part of next year. And this would be the change to the SIP, which is just mirroring the change to the rules. And that's what we're doing. Questions?
With that, I'd like to just walk through where you can find those changes in the rulemaking package.
I've got a quick question, if that's all right. You mentioned that you're the only company that can use this rule change.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little better? I mean, is that because this power plant's unique in that way, or just because they don't want anybody else using the rule, or why couldn't it expand? Why couldn't other people take advantage of the same rule?
Well, what the rule is, the requirement of the rule presently is that everybody has to report their actual SO2 emissions. What this rule change does is it requires Basin Electric to report its historical emissions rather than its lower emissions under the settlement agreement, even though we'll have to lower our emissions under the settlement agreement with respect to the NOx program. Basin Electric will be the only producer in the state that has a NOx settlement agreement with EPA that has an SO2 emissions limit component in it. So it's unique to Basin Electric. There isn't any other plant in Wyoming that has that kind of a settlement agreement with EPA.
Right.
And it's not something anybody else can take advantage of because they're required under the current law to report their actual emissions.
But could they use your pattern and do the same thing? Would it benefit him, or is this situation so unique that it probably wouldn't apply?
Well, I can tell you that the NOx BART litigation for the other power plants in Wyoming is largely completed without anybody negotiating any kind of arrangement like this one.
So they just don't need it.
They don't need it. I would consider this completely unique.
And Councilman Flitner, I would add that the litigation has been stayed with respect to the state and then other parties within that litigation. And so to the extent that there are other opportunities that may arise later, but currently that litigation is stayed. Just walking the council through the rules, if you go to page 14-40, those are the changes in the rules to Chapter 14, Section 3, subsection D that Mr. Day just mentioned. Subsection D includes the language specific to Laramie River Unit 1, reporting its sulfur dioxide emissions. And the annual sulfur dioxide emissions for Laramie River Unit 3 shall be reported as laid out in Chapter 14, Section 3B. Basin Electric shall report those emissions beginning the year that the selective catalytic reduction commences operation. And subsection E states that the division will use the annual sulfur dioxide emissions reported by basin for all purposes under Chapter 14. The other section of Chapter 14 that we have before you is the incorporation by reference, and we're updating the Code of Federal Regulations date to reflect the most recent July 1st, 2017 publication of the Code of Federal Regulation. And that concludes the updates to Chapter 14.
I've got a question, Madam Chair.
Yes.
So, if that, from a standpoint of actual emissions into the environment, those are going to be decreased because of the SCR. That'll decrease the NOx.
Correct.
And then you're also decreasing the SO2 separately as part of this NOx agreement.
Correct.
So overall, both NOx and SOx are coming down as part of the this agreement.
That's exactly right.
And so this adjustment is simply to allow this, seems like quite complicated accounting to work out.
That's correct. And the reason for it is the Regional Haze Trading Program that covers SOx, SO2, that is not regulated by BART installations. That's regulated by a trading program. And there's a baseline emission of SO2 that's going on across the state that's covered by that plan, which means with this settlement, EPA and the state are able to obtain a lower SO2 emission than they would have the power to do under the SO2 program. So it's an environmental win for SO2, but we need the rule change so that we don't count that under the SO2 trading program.
Yep. And with that, I'm open for questions if anyone has any questions.
Do you have any questions from the council? Is there anyone here who wishes to testify in support of this rule package? Is there anyone here in testimony in opposition to the rule package? Any testimony in the neutral capacity? Seeing none. Do I have a motion to approve the statement of principal reasons and the rule package as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote. Mr. Gopian?
Aye.
Palmer?
Aye.
Aye.
I will vote aye. Motion passes. The rule package has been approved.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we'll move on to rule package docket 17-2102 involving Chapter 2, Section 12, Chapter 3, Section 9, Chapter 4, Section 6, Chapter 5, Section 4, Chapter 6, Section 14, Chapter 8, Sections 3 and 10, Chapter 11, Section 2, Chapter 8, Non-Attainment Area Regulations, Section 3 of the Air Quality Division Rules. And it will be the same. Representative from DEQ.
Yes, this is Nancy Veer, Air Quality Administrator for Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Air Quality Division. And with me today is Darian Donnelly, and he will be presenting this package. And I think you noted one thing, Darian,
on the previous docket, there was also a incorporation by reference update for Chapter 14, Section 5.
Okay. Note that.
And so we can address that as here as well. This is also incorporation by reference.
Okay.
There. So it's the same principle that we come before you. We did the last one in Chapter 14 because that we were making the other changes to Chapter 14.
So incorporation by reference, or IBR, is just a mechanism to keep our state regulations consistent with federal regulations. And as you know, we refer to the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, in our Wyoming Air Quality Standards and Regulations. So what the incorporation by reference mechanism essentially does is it consolidates a pretty large collection of federal regulations, and we're able to drop these regulations into our state regs, and this all works to keep our state regs clean and concise for our users. You may remember we brought this to you last year, and we're attempting to make this an annual effort. So today we'll be updating from 2016 to July 1st, 2017. And specifically, we'll be updating the Wyoming Air Quality Standards and Regulations for Chapter 2, Ambient Standards, Section 12, and that's page 2-7. Chapter 3, General Emission Standards, Section 9, that's 3-47. Chapter 4, State Performance Standards and Specific Existing Sources, Section 6. Chapter 5, National Emission Standards, Section 4. Chapter 6, Permitting Requirements, Section 14. Chapter 8, Non-Attainment Area Regulations, Section 10. And Chapter 11, National Acid Rain Program, Section 2. And, our other change that we are proposing today will be located Chapter 8, Non-Attainment Area Regulations, Section 3, Conformity of General Federal Regulations to State Implementation Plans. And you can find that on page 8-24. Back in 2010, the Wyoming Air Quality Standards and Regulations for general conformity were updated, and this very minor issue was noted. In Section 3C, Romanet 11, H, 1, and capital D was inadvertently left as PM10 rather than changed to PM for a particular matter. The change to the PM will just address both PM10 and PM 2.5, so we won't have any trouble there. It's just an overall encompassing thing. It's important to note the error was found by EPA and currently does not have any practical consequences for the state, but because all of Wyoming is designated as attainment/unclassifiable for both the 97 PM 2.5 NAAQS and the 2006 24-hour PM 2.5 NAAQS. Therefore, general conformity for PM 2.5 does not apply to Wyoming. And we thought it would be best to take care of this revision during a rulemaking as a proactive measure instead of waiting until we actually did have a non-attainment area for 2.5 to actually have to fix it. And
with that, we'll turn it over if there's any questions on this incorporation by reference.
Any questions for any of the council members?
I have a question. So some of these changes are part of an annual update to adopt by reference. Mm-hmm. But some of these say incorporation by reference involve changes to the state implementation plan. Were there significant changes required in that CFR update to the state implementation plan, or we're just making sure that we're referring to the right CFR?
At the latter, the correct reference to the most recent update to the CFR becomes then part of our state implementation plan.
Okay.
And with the exception of the Chapter 8 non-attainment area regulation that is reflecting particulate matter PM instead of just the PM10 reference. That's the only substantive change.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions?
Just a general question, since we're talking about kind of updates and sticking with the federal standards. As I haven't been following what's going on with the Air Advisory Board, do you anticipate seeing a lot more changes, or just kind of curious what you're hearing from Region 8 and from EPA as it relates to air quality kind of across the board? Is it going to be a busy year for you all?
Be happy to answer that.
That's a broad question for you. So.
Happy to answer that. And I'll back up. When President Trump took office, there were a variety of executive orders. And so at the federal level, the federal agencies are working through the process. And I believe they have different recommendations with respect to rulemaking. They have not reached the level where they're publishing those in the Federal Register and taking comment yet on those. We anticipate that, depending on their priority list, we may see some of those regulations come through and affect states. So we anticipate that we'll see the work. We haven't yet. There is a proposed repeal of the Clean Power Plan that EPA is taking comments on right now. And most of those federal actions are at the national level. The regional level, the region does state implementation plan approvals for the most part. We have some pending approvals with EPA Region 8. One example is our Sheridan non-attainment redesignation that we're waiting for EPA action on. So we hope that EPA Region 8 action will be approvals, and full approvals.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Are there any testimony in support of this rule package? Any testimony in opposition? Any testimony in a neutral capacity? Seeing none, we will go ahead and vote. Oh, I need a motion to pass the rule package. I'm sorry. Second?
Second.
Now I will take a vote. Tim?
Aye.
Aye.
Nick?
Aye.
I will vote aye also. Pass this rulemaking package.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate all the work you've done. Is there any other items to come before the council?
I don't know if it's items before the council, and I don't know if this would be an executive session. I'd be curious to get an update from Jim and from you or from Brian about what's going on with the FOIA request.
Okay.
We could do that tomorrow if we're going to do it then. But I'd just be curious to hear what's going on with those.
Nick would like to have a discussion about what's going on with the legal proceedings with Brooke.
The FOIA.
With the FOIA request for Brooke.
They've all of our emails that they've requested have been sent to them.
Okay.
It's my understanding they've done another one, but
They've reached out to DW. I just got that today. I'll send that to our council tomorrow. Any emails they got, but
And how was the request for emails from your personal account addressed?
it was addressed in two parts. One, it was addressed in that I don't have an account, ru5@netscape.com. But then I also told them the two email accounts I do have. And I searched those email accounts to ensure that my memory was not incorrect. And there are no emails associated with any of the business of the council through my email, my personal email.
Great.
And that, and all of our, just so you understand the process by which we do FOIAs, because this is the first one I've ever done. When we get it, I contacted Ryan. Ryan then, through him, contacts ETS and makes the formal request for them to provide whatever fits within the category of their request. They do that. We get that. Ryan goes through it to analyze whether there's any attorney-client privilege or any other exceptions that may apply to any of the documents. We then, once that's done, then what we ended up having to do is convert all this Outlook, ETS had to convert them from Google Mail to Outlook. And then we took them from Outlook and converted them to PDFs. And then we took the attachments and because when you print them off, it doesn't print everything off. So you print the emails, then you take the attachments and slide them in so they come after the email they were attached to. Then we created one big e-file and then sent that to them.
And then, Brian, we had discussed this, and there was nothing that was withheld for attorney-client privilege?
No, there wasn't. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, discussion? Then we will recess the hearing until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for more items. Contested case hearing. I know it wasn't order of the
I looked at that.